Hello, everyone, and thank you for turning into this presentation. You will notice that we don't see participants. When I gave my workshop this morning, Canadian time, unfortunately, there was a problem with recording, and only half of the session got recorded. So I decided rather than upload half of a session, I would just go ahead and re-record the presentation so that I could put it on the YouTube channel, just as a way to recognize the generosity of the organizers in putting together this conference. I wanted to make sure that I could contribute my little part. So my presentation is called SHOC, a solution-focused framework for complex and difficult situations. So, let me start off just by telling you a little bit about me. I have a background in teaching and crisis intervention, which is kind of a weird combination of a career. But I started my career as a high school teacher, quite rapidly, picked up jobs working with students with significant behavioral issues. That led me at the time in the 1990s when there were not a lot of teaching jobs where I was living to start taking positions in organizations that worked exclusively with youth who are having difficulty, and I really caught the bug of more working on the mental health side of things. So I left behind teaching, got the training that I needed to do that work, and among that training was the solution-focused approach, among other things, because it was an approach that I could learn without being a psychotherapist or a professional counselor. And from there, my work has much more been in the counseling vein, but with community-based organizations. So I'm not a therapist, but my work has looked a bit more, I suppose, like counseling than it has like coaching. So I've been using and learning about solution-focused practices for more than, I said, about 20 years. On the slide, I think I didn't want to do the calculation. I wanted to feel young. It's been more than 20 years. And I would say I've been, continuing to learn. Every conference I come to, every meeting, every time I'm together with the community, I learn something new. So hopefully, these kinds of conferences are a way for me to give something back. Now, I am currently working as a solution-focused trainer in Montreal. So I provide training to people in mental health agencies, in schools, in a variety of settings, and it's generally people doing some kind of counseling work. So if we go back to, SHOC, this framework is an acronym based on really, where we try to put together some tools that would help people with their reactions when they're working with cases that are really difficult. So when we have clients, when we have situations that are not just complicated problems in difficult contexts, but interactions, relationships that are more difficult to manage. And I think we probably all have those experiences. I don't know that we talk about them a lot sometimes in solution-focused spaces, but I think we must all, I don't think I'm the only one who comes to situations sometimes experiencing difficulties. And I like to have images that might maybe bring that message home and make you smile as well at the same time. So if we can think about, those situations where we're working with clients who seem to be stuck in the problem, that feeling that I'm trying really hard, but I can't get them to move past that. I can't find my way out. The client is stuck in the problem, and maybe I'm stuck in the problem with them. And a large part of the work that I've done that's solution focused has been in the context of suicide prevention. So I worked for a suicide prevention center where I was a trainer, and I was also working on the helpline answering calls from people who were in danger of suicide. So you'll notice through the presentation, I mean, this tool is not exclusively for suicide prevention, but if I talk about examples, most of them are going to come from that context because that's where being solution focused has been the biggest challenge for me. It's where it's been hardest, and it's also where it's been most rewarding. And that's a context where you have a lot of people who are stuck in the problem, right? Because that is pretty much the definition of being in danger for suicide is being stuck in the problem and having a hard time seeing it behind it. So that's, difficult. I've worked with people sometimes who, along with, being stuck and frustrated, gave me the sense that maybe they were passive. From my point of view, they weren't doing everything they needed to do to get better. And all of these reactions are obviously a really unfair interpretation of what's going on with the person. I may not be the biggest expert in solution focused work, but I do know enough to know that people are always doing the best they can at any given moment, but it doesn't always feel like that from my point of view. We get in those situations of frustration. It's not working the way we want. I think it's pretty human to sometimes have an interpretation that's not helpful. And some of my interpretations that are not helpful have been, this person's too passive. In all of the jobs, whether I've been working in schools or treatment centers or at the suicide prevention center, I've come across relationships that were difficult, clients who were difficult to connect with, conversations that were abrasive, times when I felt that people were rude or disrespectful to me, people who had really challenging behavior, whether those were teenagers or adults. And again, if I'm solution focused, I always want to believe that there's a good reason behind difficult behavior, but it doesn't always feel like that in the moment. And I sometimes feel like what's going on in this picture. Probably some of the most difficult reactions I've had been moments where I have come to think, even briefly, that, maybe this person is a bit too dramatic. Maybe this person's exaggerating what's going on. Maybe, and again, I'm never proud of those reactions, but I think sometimes it's a human reaction when we're immersed in really problematic situations to sometimes want to believe that the person's exaggerating what's going on with them. I've certainly had my share of times when what I felt like what I was offering was not appreciated, where the person didn't like the help that I was giving, where I could sense that dissatisfaction, that they were really not pleased, and that made it harder for me. That opinion I had, that reaction that I had, made it harder for me to do my job. Sometimes it's not even, not a question of the relationship and how we work together, but maybe a feeling like people take the first step, but they don't follow up. And I can see all the things that they could do based on our work together that would make their lives easier, and a bit of a frustration or dismay that they're not following up. And again, always an interpretation that's not helpful. If I'm solution focused, I need to always remember that people are always doing as much as they can, and they're doing the things that are meaningful for them. But because I'm a human being at the same time, I can sometimes have that frustration that they're not doing more. If you look at, all of those kinds of situations, and this is, just a few examples from my experience, I'm sure you can identify other ones that are different. The impact, how it makes me feel, and the impact it has on my work. I've got some photos for that too. One of the things that I'll experience is, sometimes these difficult situations make me feel helpless and hopeless. And I really love this picture because I think it captures a moment of compassion and, on some level, love in a large sense, but it's also discouragement and helplessness and hopelessness. And I've certainly felt that when things have been difficult and when I've been too connected to what people are going through. So sometimes it's helplessness and hopelessness. Other times it's stress, it's anxiety, especially in the moment of a conversation that's not going well. Sometimes it's frustration and irritation that I will do my very best to hide. And a lot of the work I've done, at least in suicide prevention, has been over the phone. That makes that a little bit easier. But even then, even on the phone, people pick up on tones in your voice. And I never want to be in that position. But now and then, I have that reaction. And whether I'm helpless and hopeless or stressed and anxious or feeling a bit irritated, it definitely gives me the impulse to push away, to avoid, to say, oh no, not that person again, to try to distance myself from the situation. And again, I'm assuming I don't, because I'm recording this on my own, I don't have smiling faces nodding, but I'm assuming that I'm not the only solution focused practitioner who has some of these reactions when things are difficult. And as a trainer, it's always been a big interest of mine to find tools that can help other people deal with the difficulty, certainly that I had when I was learning and that I still have now that I have more experience. So one of those tools is this framework, the solution focused framework, which is an acronym for four qualities that we feel people need to be solution focused in their work. So whether you're doing coaching or counseling or therapy or supervision or whatever you're doing, we think that to be solution focused, we need to have compassion, we need to have humility, we need to have optimism, and we need to have curiosity. And this work comes from some early training that my colleague Brigitte Lavoie developed at Lavoie Solutions, where this was part of our basic training. We tried to introduce this idea, and we realized that we weren't really able to exploit it properly. There was not enough time to really get into it, so we removed it. We set it aside and thought we're going to have to come back to this and find a way to package it alone so that people can really think about it and talk about it. And that's where this framework comes from. So you could probably make a list of separate qualities. I want to preface this by saying this framework, this acronym, it's not a scientific tool. It's not something that we've done research on. It's not something that's published. It's a tool we developed working with training clients and working together that we thought might help. So these are our four qualities. You might have others, but these are the ones that we have found most helpful in our work and that our clients have told us were helpful too. And it comes down to, how do we manage our reaction to difficult cases? Because it is the thing we have control over. We don't have control over what clients do, what's happening in their lives, and we don't want that control. We do, however, have control over our reactions, and how we take in those moments and how we deal with them. And looking at compassion, humility, optimism, and curiosity is a pretty concrete tool to analyze what's going on. So with that acronym, we introduce an idea that, for some people is kind of surprising. We started to ask ourselves, beyond the idea that you have to have compassion, humility, optimism, and curiosity, is it possible that you could have too much of them and not just not enough? And again, not a, it's one framework, it's our framework, but is it possible? We know we can sometimes have struggle with compassion, we can lack compassion. But could you have too much sometimes? We know that we want to make sure that we're not lacking humility. We need to be humble. But could we be too humble sometimes? We know that being solution focused takes optimism. Could we sometimes be too optimistic? And we know that being solution focused requires curiosity. Could we sometimes have too much? So we created this graphic with the sliders with the idea that, maybe we need to adjust so that we're somewhere in the middle because the gray bars on the left and the right might be the zone where it's too much or too little, and it might contribute to the difficulties that we're having in that conversation. So maybe we'll sort of tackle one at a time. If we talk about compassion, it's a strange idea to think about too much. So let's start with, what's easier. The thing that I think we recognize more quickly when we're lacking compassion, when we're flagging on that, we're going to experience impatience, frustration, and we're likely to have unrealistic expectations. And I don't think anybody ever starts this work, setting out to lack compassion, but it's probably a pretty human, common experience that sometimes with some people, we struggle to have the level of compassion that's helpful. And when that happens, if we can recognize it, realize that that's what's going on, maybe we can adjust our work. Maybe we can have questions that focus on values and strengths. Maybe we can remind ourselves the good intentions behind behavior that's difficult to manage. Maybe we can focus on the efforts. Um, Maybe we can also consider the context that the person is living in. Issues, for example, of oppression and inequality. Do those explain what's going on? And when I connect to that and I think about it, maybe it helps boost the compassion that I feel and it helps me adjust my expectations. And on the flip side, and again, is it possible to have too much compassion? I don't know. I don't think we'll ever be able to prove that. Maybe not everyone will agree. But as a framework, it helps me to realize that sometimes I might go so far in feeling compassionate that I get helpless and hopeless because I'm so connected in compassion to people's difficulties, to their problems, to their suffering. I so want to be there and compassionate that maybe it goes too far and I start to lose hope for them. And we know how important it is in not just solution focused work, any work that we do in coaching, leadership, therapy, counseling, our hope, just our belief that the person can get better is really central. And the research demonstrates, that it's as important or more than the techniques we use. So can we maybe dial the compassion back a little bit and ask coping questions? Can we be more focused on what the person's doing up to now that's helping them to cope? That's helping them to function. That's helping them to show up for an appointment. That keeps them from giving up. Can we spend a bit more energy exploring the successful past, which is hard to do if we're really connected just with the suffering? Can we pull back from it a bit and focus on what they are doing now that works and what they've done in the past that works, that might help them feel a little bit better and might help us feel a bit more hopeful and helpful in this situation. In terms of humility, again, if we're lacking humility, we know that the position of a solution-focused practitioner is to lead from one step behind. And it's important that we're not in a position of expertise. Our job is to be humble. And when we're not humble, we experience impatience and frustration and we give advice, right? When we think we have the answers, when we think they're the expert, we give advice. And that is the opposite of being solution focused. So if we lack humility, maybe we find ourselves in that position of giving advice or feeling frustrated or impatient. We could stop and come back to the importance of building solutions with the person instead of giving advice. We can pay attention to how our compliments are phrased so it doesn't sound like an assessment of their lives coming from on high. We can adjust our expectations for what's going to happen. And then that kind of odd idea that maybe we could also be too humble. Maybe if we don't provide enough leadership, maybe we're going to lack direction and we're going to be less helpful. So, if we think of that lead from one step behind, maybe we need to be more directive. Maybe we need to put more focus on the lead part rather than the one step behind, because some people need us to provide that structure to help them move forward. And can we make sure that it's the right level of structure and directiveness and that it's not falling into expertise, but it is providing help and helping people move forward. And I think, helping them move forward rather than pulling them forward. If we think about optimism, obviously lack of optimism is going to contribute to directly to hopelessness and helplessness. And when that happens, some of the things we do are we ask more coping questions. Because if we're losing optimism for the person, connecting to how they're coping can build our sense of optimism for them. We can do the same thing with exploring the preferred future. What would they want instead of the problem? How are they managing up to now? What have they done in the past? What have they done with this situation? What have they done to get through similar situations or other difficult situations? And using amplification questions, so getting detailed explanations of those things can build optimism. It can help us feel more helpful and hopeful with that person. At the same time, if we're too optimistic, we may find ourselves with unrealistic expectations. Again, with that sense of needing to pull them forward rather than leading from one step behind. And we may underestimate the danger sometimes. And that may not apply to everyone watching this video, but if we're in a role where part of our professional responsibility is assessing danger, for example, suicide or other self-harming behaviors, potentially other things like child protection, if there's this as issue of safety, we really need to be careful not to be too optimistic. So yes, we get details about their preferred future and their successful past, but the details will tell us what's realistic. If I explore someone's at their very best, and I ask for examples when they've been at their very best handling a difficult or dangerous behavior, and those examples are fragile, and they're getting by, but it's not strong, that may mean I need to provide more protection. And the example, again, because that's been my background, if I'm working with someone who is both thinking about suicide and impulsive, and I ask for examples when they've been able to better control their behavior around their suicidal ideation, and what they give me is not solid, then I'm going to take those answers and I'm going to amplify them and I'm going to recognize them and we're going to celebrate those small things they do to stay safe. But I'm also going to need to provide more security around them. I'm going to need to build a structure around them that keeps them safe, because at their best, right now, they're not terribly strong with that. So we can use details to assess danger and keep people safe. And we can also make sure that our optimism, beyond safety issues, just in maybe, less stressful conversations, we can make sure that we're going slowly, that we're slowing down, and we're not bombarding them with questions. Even if we have someone who's doing relatively well, if we're so optimistic that we're going too quickly, we're rushing the discussion, we're asking one question after another, we're going to lose that, the ability to communicate with them. We're going to lose that link and they're going to back up. So if we can dial down the optimism, sometimes it helps us go slowly and it helps us notice everything we need to take care of people. And then finally, we can think about curiosity. So lack of curiosity, if we're asking surface questions and we're not exploring detailed answers, we're probably going to end up doing superficial work that doesn't have much impact on the person. And when that happens, we've got to go back. We've got to focus on values and strengths and good intentions and efforts. And we've got to try to amplify those answers to prefer future questions and successful past. We need to be more curious about what they want and about what they've done in the past that works. At the same time, maybe, and again, this is our way of looking at it. One way of looking at it is that it's possible sometimes to be too curious. And particularly, what are we using our curiosity for? I might sometimes be too curious about the problem. When I'm working in a situation, especially where I have to assess something, I may tell myself that I need more details about the problem because that's going to help me keep the person safe. And then I have to stop and say, but do I really need to know more about the problem or do I want to know more about the problem? Because we're human, even though we're solution focused, and problems are generally interesting. They're fascinating. Human beings are drawn to that kind of information, and we have a tendency to be curious. And for a lot of us, it's easier to be curious about the problem than it is about the preferred future and about strengths and about resources. So, am I using my curiosity for the right thing? Am I focusing, if I do have to have information about the problem, do I really need it? Or is it just something I want to know? I think someone else in a conference mentioned, is the information TBU? Is it true but useless? And can I really focus on useful information if I need it? And if I don't need it, I don't ask those questions. Can I slow down and make sure that I'm not bombarding the person with questions? Can I take the time to ask one question at a time and really be interested in the answers and can validate efforts and emotions rather than the problem? So adjusting levels can help. And we worked with the framework in that way for a while. And then at some point we realized, well, there's adjusting the levels and then there's also interactions. There may be combinations of things with these qualities, these characteristics that make a difference as well. So we started to think like let's look at how that might work. And these are very personal. These are for me, these are individually how this works for me. You might have an entirely different set of things that are happening. But here's some examples. If I look at when I'm a little bit too much in compassion and connected to pain and suffering, and I lack optimism, that's going to contribute for me to a sense of hopelessness and helplessness. It's a perfect storm for me. Too much compassion, not enough optimism really contributes to a sense of hopelessness and helplessness. So I've got to find ways to boost my optimism. And when I do that, it generally helps me. The more optimistic I am, the less connected to the suffering I am. And it allows me to be just compassionate enough. And I made sure, when I made the slide, it's right at the edge. I want to be as compassionate as possible without slipping over into the too much connection to suffering, and then I lose hope. Another example, if I have feeling low on compassion and I'm too optimistic, that's probably going to make me feel frustrated and impatient. So maybe what I need to do is, bring down my optimism, something that's more realistic and respectful of where the person is. And that's going to help me feel more compassionate rather than frustrated because they're not moving at the pace that I hope they will want to move. I might at some point feel a little too humble, really take that idea of leading from one step behind and not being an expert. Sometimes for some people, I might take that too far. And if you combine that with a lack of curiosity about their strengths, about their hopes and their dreams, it can create a lack of directivity. And maybe I'm not going to be as helpful as they need me to be in that meeting. So what I need to do is, you know, um, maybe be a little bit less humble. Maybe see my role as more active, see that I have a leadership role in this conversation, and that person's relying on me to help them move forward. And then, increase my curiosity about their hopes, about their dreams, about what they've done in the past, and really look for that information because I know that they've come to me for help and that's going to help them to move forward. And one final example, if I have, struggling with both optimism and curiosity, it probably means I'm going to be stuck in problem talk. If I'm not feeling optimistic and I'm not really going out to look for things that will help me feel optimistic, I'm going to feel stuck. And the person's going to be stuck in problem talk too. So I'm going to try to boost my optimism, boost my curiosity about what they want instead of the problem, about what they're doing up to now that works even a little bit, about what they've done in other situations in the past. So those are all examples that are really personal to me. And when I was doing the conference with participants, one of the participants asked, like, I noticed that there are some where you didn't, there's only one or two, and there are some that you didn't use at all. And I said, that's because it's just, these are my sliders. You might find that being stuck in problem talk is something entirely different. And for you, it's not a question of optimism and curiosity. Maybe it's a question of humility and compassion. It's something else. So the idea of the framework is that it's flexible enough that you can look at it and say, for me, what do I think is going on? Which one needs to be tweaked, which needs to be increased or decreased, what's the combination, what's the interaction that I have to look after because of how I work, because of my personality, because of how I think see things, and to really personalize it for you. And finally, if we want to use that framework, it's really important to look at how what's our internal dialogue about people? What are we saying to ourselves about our clients in the moment that we're having these difficult reactions? So I've got some examples, and these are classics. These are either things that I have thought or felt myself, or things that I hear quite often when I train people, when I train and I coach people. This is a really common message that I hear. All she wants to do is talk about the problem. She has a victim mentality. And I do most of my training now in French, and in French there is a sentence called, which is "elle se victimise," and if I were to literally translate it, it would be something like she victimizes herself. And I don't think that word, it's a word in English. I don't think in English you can victimize yourself, but I think it demonstrates like that's an extreme statement to make about someone, right? To say they have a victim mentality. But I also think, because I hear this from people who are kind and generous and who genuinely want to help and who are intelligent and competent. I think if people fall into this trap, we maybe, need to extend that same compassion that we do for clients. We need to extend it to the people helping them. It must be really difficult for someone to come to a point where they tell themselves all she really wants to do is talk about the problem. She has a victim mentality. And when I work with folks like that, the first thing I ask them to do is to separate interpretations from facts. And that is really not easy to do. It's a lot harder than it looks. So if I want to separate interpretation from facts, I take the exact same message and I cross out everything that's not an observable fact. Can never say all she wants to do is talk about the problem, because no, first of all, that's physically impossible. That all someone can do is talk about the problem. How do I know that that's all she wants? That's an interpretation. That's my judgment call. She has a victim mentality. That's entirely an interpretation. So if we take it back to observable facts that are indisputable, she talks about the problem. And if I tell myself she talks about the problem, it's a lot easier for me to adjust afterwards. It's a lot easier for me to have a kinder and more welcoming attitude. And if I'm still in that frustration, it's easier for me to make the changes. So here's an example of, how the framework might help. I've taken out the interpretations and I match. She talks a lot about the problem. Uh, Here are some other, some interpretations that might help. And obviously, in an ideal world, I would not interpret at all. I would simply say she talks about the problem and I would change how I work. And I really admire people who can do that. I've read the books. The first place that I learned about this was reading things from Steve DeShazer. I'm sure Steve DeShazer was really good at not interpreting, but I unfortunately am not. Interpretation comes really easily to me. It comes quickly. It's something that I struggle with all the time, and I can't always come back to just the facts. And when I can't come back to just the facts, what I try to do is just change my interpretation. Okay, if you have to interpret and you can't avoid it, how can you interpret this in a way that makes you feel compassionate, that makes you feel kind, that helps you connect, and that makes you want to help this person? So here are, just again, these are personal examples. They could be completely different for you, but here are my interpretations in these examples that help me. Instead of saying she has a victim mentality, I'll try to tell myself she's been through a lot and she has difficulty talking about other things. If I say that to myself, my compassion is boosted automatically. And it allows me to say, she's managed to keep going despite all of this. She hasn't given up. And that's going to boost my optimism. And I can tell myself, now I'm going to have to ask what she wants instead of the problem with some future questions and how she's managed to cope up to now with some past questions. And to do that, I'm going to need to be more curious rather than getting stuck with her in the problem talk. Another example, he rejects all of my ideas. All of my ideas. He's resisting. And again, mix of fact and interpretation. What we can say without a doubt is he rejects all of my ideas. That's pretty observable. He's resisting is an interpretation of that behavior. And I have no idea if that's why he's rejecting all of my ideas. Perhaps my ideas are no good. So if we can come back to just facts, he rejects all of my ideas. And again, if I can't avoid interpretation, then I'll give myself an interpretation that boosts my compassion. It's hard to accept someone else's ideas when things are difficult. I don't know if my interpretations are more true than the others, but I know that they make it easier for me to be compassionate. They make it easier for me to adjust my level of humility and optimism. So I'm going to start with something that helps me. It's hard to accept someone else's ideas when things are difficult. Boost my compassion. I can increase my humility. And instead of offering my solutions, I can work on identifying his solutions. So I can come back to that solution focused base, uh, assuming, and again, what I'm doing right now is not working. So I've got to change it and I've got to focus on what he has done. And I can also think, I have to be careful not to move quickly or to push too hard because we're already in this kind of contentious conversation. So maybe I'm going to dial back the optimism, go more slowly, and really follow step by step my client rather than trying to pull him forward. And a final example, he yells and swears at me a lot. He's a violent person. Again, if we separate fact from interpretation, it's pretty observable fact when someone's yelling and swearing. But that doesn't, I have no way of knowing if he's a violent person. And it's not helpful for me to think in terms of is he a violent person or not? I mean, can we reduce someone who has issues with behavior to a violent person? Philosophically, I'm not sure I ever want to do that. But even if you could argue that violent people exist and there are people who are violent by nature, even if you could convince me that that's true, it's certainly not going to help me work with someone who's yelling and swearing at me if that's my starting point with them. So, what can I tell myself instead? Well, yelling and swearing are also signs of distress. Yeah, I think that's something that's reasonably easy to learn when you work in suicide prevention. At least in where I live, most people who die by suicide are men. By a good margin, there's a real gender gap. So when we work in organizations that are trying to reduce suicide, there's always an effort. How can we reach men? And how can we reach men who have a traditional definition of masculinity, which makes it much more likely for them to yell and to swear than to cry when they're feeling distress? So I can frame that behavior as a sign that they need help, as a sign of distress rather than a sign of violence. It will help me feel more compassionate. At the same time, maybe when someone is yelling and swearing, maybe I need to reduce my humility, and that's possibly a point where I have to be more directive. Because I'll have to find that line between is this person angry, yelling and swearing because he's angry? I can work with that. I have techniques and solution focused practice gives us lots of tools to help people to regain calm, to help them feel listened to and heard so that they can come down and have a conversation with us. We know how to do that. There may be a time with some people, and it's rare, but it happens, where they cross that line and it becomes threats and it does become violence and it does become dangerous. And I'm going to have to set and maintain clear boundaries so that I feel safe and that my colleagues can feel safe. So drawing that line between anger and danger, anger and violence, is not always as clear as we would like it to be. And we want to be able to go all the way up to that line. But when it does cross over into something that's dangerous, we need to be able to be firm and set those boundaries that keep everyone safe so that we can continue to help people. And finally, if I can manage to stay on the right side of that line and we're in anger, but we can help the person regain control, I'm going to pay attention to moments when the conversation is better, especially if it's an ongoing, follow-up type situation. When are the moments when the conversation is easier? What am I doing differently at that moment? How can I adjust how I work with that person so that there are fewer moments where there's anger and where there's swearing? So, what I've done, what I did in my workshop, which actually won't do with the recording, is I ask people to identify a situation with a client where they're having difficulty, and then to identify, what do you tell yourself about this person or about their situation? And whatever that message is, maybe even go as far as to write it down and separate facts from interpretations. Is there something in what you tell yourself that's more an interpretation, that's not an observable fact, that could be explained by something else? If there is, cross that out and just keep the facts. And then take a look at that framework and see, what are the things that you might like to adjust that would make it easier to approach this person? Which of the things, which do you need to slide to the right or to the left? What are the interactions between those qualities that might make a difference for you? And since we're not in an exercise, what I'm just going to go ahead and do is share this and invite you. I'm going to be providing a PDF copy of this presentation and this document to share. But in the event that you don't get that, maybe take the time to just take a quick screenshot of it so that you got all four, and maybe invite you on your own time to reflect on that. Take that situation, reduce it to the facts, and then maybe play around with these and see for you personally and your personality and the way you work and the context you're working in, which ones would you need to adjust to find solutions for that case. So I'll just give you a minute to take that screenshot. And of course, you can always rewind the video, pause it as well. So that's the end of my presentation. I would just like to thank the organizers for this wonderful conference and thank you for tuning in. And if you, I shall go back to the sharing. If you would like to get in touch with me, I'm not sure exactly how the sharing of documents is going to happen. So I'm going to go ahead and share just my contact information. Um, on my sharing has gone. Not even sure what I'm sharing anymore. Let me go ahead and find, there we go. So there is my email and website. If there's not an easy way to download the presentation, please feel free to email me and I will send you a PDF of both the presentation and that document with the details. So again, thank you very much.